today we start a new section on chamber music, and so I want to talk a little bit about that. So the term refers to the performance venue, which is music that's written for performance in a smaller room. And you generally think that there are fewer players, with each player having their own part. So this is ensemble music, so it's music for more than one person. And the emphasis is upon this teamwork, this idea of a conversation among equals. So this type of music becomes really popular in the 17th century, the beginning of the Baroque period. And we see in the Baroque period that there is just an increasing amount of instrumental music. And so this just references the fact that composers were starting to write for specific combinations of instruments. So they had a specific timbre in mind. And the most important type of chamber music that arose in the 17th century is the trio sonata. So what we're going to do today is to look at a couple of the trio sonatas that were written by Arcangelo Corelli, who's a very important Italian composer. But before we do that, let me just give you a little bit of background on a trio sonata. So a trio sonata is scored for two instrumentalists. So with Corelli, he wrote them for two violins, plus continuo. And you know that the continuo is the group that realizes the figured bass notation. So it consists of two players. So you use this term realize just to denote the fact that the keyboard player plays the bass part that's notated in the left hand, and then in the right hand will improvise the chord progressions that's indicated by the numbers below the bass line, the intervals. So the important thing to know is that there are two players in the continuo. So it's the keyboardist plus a second bass instrument, and that typically would be like a cello. And the cellist is going to double the bass line. It's going to play the same line that the left hand of the keyboard plays. So in total, you'll see on the performance of these 4 players. So you have the 2 instrumentalists, whether it's 2 violins or 2 flutes, plus then 2 players who realize the continuo part. And so, the term sonata is a term that began to appear at the end of the 16th century. And so Gabrieli was one of the first. He wrote this very famous work called Sonata Piano and Forte. So it's a work that is for brass instruments, and it features dynamic contrasts. But in the 17th century, this takes on a more specific meaning. The word sonata means to sound, so that just indicates that it is a work that is for instruments as opposed to a cantata, which is a work that's for singers. And 2 basic types of sonatas developed by around 1660 or so. One is called the Sonata da chiesa, which means church sonata. And this particular type of sonata had 4 movements. And they were in this order of tempi: slow, fast, slow, fast. So that's what you look for in that particular type. The second type then was a collection of dances, and it's called the Sonata da Camera, and that just means chamber sonata. And the Sonata da Camera featured these dance movements that were in typically binary form. So think of binary form when you're thinking of the form associated with dance. So, as this term implies, it's 2-part form. Basically, it features one theme. So this follows the doctrine of affections, that idea of having one emotion per movement. So, And binary form would just be organized by this basic chord progression. So if it's a major, it would go to the basic keys of tonic and dominant. If it's a movement in minor, it typically would go to relative major. Those are the same key relationships that we've seen in all the forms that we've looked at, except maybe with the scherzo trio. But this binary form was the most important predecessor to sonata allegro form. So this made use of the idea of tonal architecture. Which is just a basic concept of the form, the organization of the work is based upon a general key scheme, just an overall key scheme. And so this is a basic concept that arises at the same time as the major-minor system of tonality. And so that's one of the features of the Baroque era, is that use of tertian harmony and the idea of modulation, and that a piece can modulate to different keys without sacrificing the idea of being the key to which then the piece will end and return. So, one thing that we'll see in one of these dance movements is the fact that when it returns to tonic in the second half, that it will restate a portion of the beginning of the movement. And when that happens, the term rounded binary is used. So, just add this as a specific type of binary form. And so at that point, that brings back the opening. So that's very similar to the recapitulation. It's the same basic idea as a recap. And so you'll start to see in the Baroque period that the beginning of the second half features some modulation. So this is the direct predecessor of Sonata Allegro form. And Sonata Allegro form is just an elaboration on this plan that features then a contrasting B theme. So that's the main difference. And Sonata Allegro movements tend to be longer. It's just a little more elaborate. So that is what was associated with the movements in the Sonata da Camera. What happened then in the second half of the Baroque is that these two basic types of sonatas then developed into the Baroque sonata, which you think of as the sonatas that have the four movements, slow, fast. So it's like what Bach wrote for solo violin. And so that's from the Sonata da Chiesa type. The Sonata da Camera then developed into the Baroque suite, which again Bach wrote suites for solo violin, solo cello, for keyboard, and that would be a collection of dances. And so by the end of the Baroque era, then a certain order of dances was established. And so this happens at the beginning of the 18th century. So, there were standard dances in a Bach suite. And other terms, the term partita, there's another type of work that Bach wrote that featured dances. And so the four standard dances all had characteristics that have to do with the tempo, with the meter, and then other rhythmic characteristics possibly. But you should know these, and I'll just write again, these are all in binary form. So each of these dances originated in a different country in Europe. So Allemand was a German dance, and it is duple or quadruple meter. And it is a moderate tempo. And typically it would start with an upbeat. Now, this idea of dances is something which was popular at the end of the Renaissance and into the beginning of the Baroque period. And what composers would do is they would write two dances that were to be performed together. So the idea of paired dances is an important concept, and that's something that preceded then this collection of dances. So I'll write here some examples of paired dances. And the basic idea is that the dances would form contrast with each other. It would usually be a slower dance that was in duple or quadruple, and then a faster dance that was in triple. And so the Allemand would be paired with the courant. Those two dances then are the first two dances that are typical in a Bach suite. Another example is Pavane and Godard. So you see keyboard examples that arose at the beginning of the Baroque period. There's a collection, a really important collection of British keyboard music that's was published, that's called the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book. So music publishing is something that arose in the Renaissance that began around 1500 in Italy. And Petrucci was the first music publisher. And so this is something, of course, that makes music much more accessible because it's so much easier to disseminate the music. So pair dances were a real popular type of early published music. So the courant, there actually are two versions. There's a French version and an Italian version of it. And this is the French spelling.